Emilia was a well-liked and normal high school student who enjoyed the typical teenage activities, spending time with friends, excelling in her studies, and being part of school clubs. Her teachers and classmates knew her as a dedicated student with a bright future. However, things started changing when she began to exhibit strange behaviors that no one could explain. At first, it was subtle. She would zone out in class, staring blankly at the blackboard for long periods. Her friends joked that she was spacey, but it became apparent that something was wrong when she began speaking to herself in odd, guttural murmurs. Her friends dismissed it at first, but the frequency of these occurrences started raising alarm bells. One afternoon, while working on a group project, Emilia had an outburst that stunned everyone. She suddenly began to laugh hysterically, but not in a way that was in sync with anything happening around her. Her laughter was shrill and unnatural, as if it was coming from somewhere deep within her that didn't belong. Her friends were concerned, unsure whether it was a joke or if something was seriously off. When they tried to talk to her, she seemed to snap out of it for a moment, but her eyes remained distant, almost hollow. This strange behavior escalated quickly. The following week, Emilia's friends noticed her whispering in what seemed like a foreign language, a language none of them recognized. When they asked her what she was saying, she would either ignore them or snap back with a cold, almost hostile stare. It was clear that something was wrong, but it wasn't until she began to exhibit physical signs of distress that the situation grew more alarming. One day, Emilia's body began jerking and convulsing in odd, mechanical movements, as if she was being controlled by something beyond her will. Her friends were terrified and didn't know how to help her. She became withdrawn, hardly speaking to anyone unless it was in that strange foreign tongue, and her presence became unsettling to those around her. Her behavior started affecting her school performance. Teachers noticed she was no longer the studious, polite student they knew. She would sit in class, eyes glazed over, sometimes muttering to herself in the middle of lessons. But it wasn't just at school. At home, Emilia's family noticed her erratic behavior as well. She stopped eating properly, spending long hours alone in her room with the door locked. When they knocked, there was never any response. Her parents grew increasingly worried, but they couldn't figure out what was happening to their daughter. It wasn't just a phase or stress or depression. It was something darker. Things took an even darker turn one evening when her mother heard a strange noise coming from Emilia's room. She opened the door and found her daughter standing at the edge of her bed, her head tilted at a grotesque angle, her eyes wide open but black as night. Emilia wasn't speaking anymore. Instead, she was emitting low, animalistic growls. Her mouth opened unnaturally wide, and a deep, distorted voice that was definitely not her own came from within her. It was an eerie, guttural language that sent chills down her mother's spine. Terrified, Emilia's parents tried to comfort her, but she wasn't responding to them at all. It was as though the person they knew was no longer there. She began to show physical signs of possession, with her body contorting in ways that defied human anatomy. At one point, Emilia's hands turned stiff and claw-like, and her movements became jerky and uncoordinated, as if she was struggling against an invisible force. No matter how much her family tried to reach out to her, it was as if they were talking to a stranger, something unrecognizable trapped inside her. Her parents realized that Emilia's transformation wasn't simply a mental or emotional breakdown. Something far more sinister had taken hold of her. Desperate for help, they began to seek answers from doctors and mental health professionals, but no one had an explanation. Some suggested that it was a case of severe dissociative identity disorder, but nothing seemed to fit. As time passed and Emilia's condition worsened, her family was left with only one option. They had to turn to something more extreme: spiritual intervention. With their options running out, Emilia's family turned to the only other source of help they knew could offer a solution: spiritual intervention. They contacted a local priest who was known for his work in performing exorcisms. This priest had dealt with cases of possession before and had a reputation for helping those in need. Although Emilia's parents were hesitant and unsure, the situation had become too dangerous to ignore. They hoped the priest's spiritual strength would be able to help their daughter, who had been completely overtaken by this dark presence. The priest arrived at their home late one evening, bringing with him various sacred items, holy water, blessed oils, and prayer books filled with ancient texts used to confront the demonic forces. He spoke with Emilia's family, offering words of comfort while explaining the gravity of the situation. The priest assured them that, with faith, the evil inside Emilia could be expelled. But he warned them that the ritual would be difficult and could take time. It would require patience, dedication, and a firm belief in the power of divine intervention. The exorcism began with solemn prayers, the priest invoking the name of God to drive out the malevolent spirit that had overtaken Emilia. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The atmosphere in the room was tense but quiet, as the priest and his assistants continued to chant in ancient languages. Emilia's eyes remained closed, but her breathing grew heavy, and the air grew thick with a cold, oppressive energy. The priest sprinkled holy water on Emilia and commanded the demon to reveal itself. That's when things took a terrifying turn. Emilia's body began to convulse violently. Her limbs jerked and twisted unnaturally, and her voice, no longer her own, echoed through the room in a demonic tone. The foreign language Emilia had been speaking earlier became louder and more forceful, the words dripping with malice. Her family watched in horror as the priest continued his prayers, but the presence inside Emilia seemed to resist. For hours, the struggle between the holy forces and the evil within Emilia's body continued, with the room growing colder and darker by the minute. At one point, the priest called upon the strongest sacred relics, his voice rising as he commanded the demon to leave Emilia's body. It was then that a loud guttural scream echoed through the house, so intense that it felt as though the walls were shaking. Emilia's body went completely limp, and for a moment, there was an eerie silence. The priest, his face pale and exhausted, looked at Emilia's family and nodded. The exorcism was over. Emilia woke up hours later, confused and disoriented. The blackness in her eyes was gone, replaced with her normal, frightened expression. She was weak, physically drained from the battle that had occurred within her, but she was free. The family embraced her, crying tears of relief, but they knew this dark chapter in their lives would haunt them forever. Though Emilia recovered physically, the memory of the exorcism and the horrors they had faced never left her or her family. The darkness that had nearly consumed their daughter was gone, but they would always remain vigilant, for they had come face to face with something that was never truly gone.